Homa nga Charlie Smith, Jong Benji, Georgia Strait. I'm Charlie Smith, editor of the Georgia Strait, and I'm happy to be back on another week on WOW TV. I'm going to start with one of the biggest stories that kind of got the legislature rolling after 200 days. It was there were no sessions, and they were back for the spring session. And right out of the blocks, the opposition New Democrats went after the BC government in connection with a court decision. And this court decision by Justice Susan Griffin had concluded that the BC government actually tried to provoke a full-scale teacher strike last year. And this was a very serious ruling. It came down in connection with the BC Teachers Federation challenge of Bill 22, which basically took away their right to negotiate class size and class composition. So you have this big case before the courts dealing with the education system, the legislation that basically says what teachers can negotiate. And it turns out the judge comes down with this kind of shocking conclusion that the government was actually involved in trying to provoke a teacher strike. Well, of course, this is of current concern to parents who have children in the school system, because they're not actually going to be very happy if the government's trying to cause a strike. So the Premier, Christy Clark, has tried to deny that the government tried to provoke a teacher's strike, and she's basically tried to make the case that the judge got her facts wrong. Of course, the judge, it was a 155-page decision. She heard the evidence, weighed it, and drew this conclusion and imposed basically a $2 million award that the government has to provide to the teachers, and then go back and rewrite the legislation. This has a long history, this story. It goes back to 2002 when Christy Clark was the education minister for the province under Premier Gordon Campbell, and they decided that they wanted to have more flexibility in dealing with class size and class composition, which often involves the placement of children with special needs in the classrooms and the amount of support that they get. So what the government of the day back in 2002 concluded, and this was written in an email that was actually sent to Christy Clark, was that by changing the contract provisions, basically ripping up the contract and replacing it with legislation, at that time it was called Bill 29, the government would save $275 million a year. So by changing the provisions of the contract back then, the government saved $275 million a year, and then you can do the math and you can see we're talking serious money. But the teachers challenged the legislation. This came after the Hospital Employees Union also challenged legislation that ripped up their contracts. It gets a bit complicated, but what happened was the Supreme Court of Canada ruled in the Hospital Employees Union case that it was unconstitutional what the government did, that it interfered with their constitutional right to freedom of assembly under Section 2. So basically what the Supreme Court of Canada ruled was that collective bargaining, that unions' right to collectively bargain on behalf of their members, was actually a protected provision in the Constitution. So then the BC Supreme Court had to deal with the teachers, because the Teachers Federation then went to the Supreme Court to get a ruling after the HEU ruling, and that was a bit of a slam dunk. So the Justice Susan Griffin said yes, their constitutional rights were infringed, the government has to go back and rewrite the legislation. So that was the backstory. So there's a long history of recrimination between the government and the teachers union, but particularly Christy Clark, because she was the architect of this along with Gordon Campbell back in 2002. So you flash forward now to 2014, the Supreme Court justice has said that the provincial government tried to provoke a teachers' strike. The government has decided to appeal that ruling, but the NDP opposition came firing away in the legislature on the first day of question period and was asking, well, when the ruling came down, it was actually as a result of testimony by the government's own chief negotiator, Paul Strazak. So Paul Strazak was testifying under oath, and he said things that, he was discussing with the government the advantages of a full-scale strike, because that would, he said in his words, you need a social license to legislate. If the teachers were launching limited job action, there wouldn't be public support for legislation. So now the government is in a bind, because in the eyes of many parents, they were trying to provoke a teacher strike. The government has denied this. Christy Clark has been quite emphatic that her government did not try to provoke a teacher strike. The case is under appeal, and in the meantime, the NDP is able to make the case that the government did try to provoke a teacher strike, and all the government can say, and this is Suzanne Anton, the Attorney General, stands up in the legislature and says the case is before the courts, it's under appeal. But the NDP wants the provincial government to release the cabinet documents that were associated with this. The NDP is basing its questions on transcripts of the court case. So it's a complicated issue, but it affects, hundreds of thousands of parents across the province, and it's one that we're going to continue watching.